So today we're going to talk about those children that have speech and language impairments, and this is a higher incidence disability. So when we talk about this population, we are talking about children who have quite a variety of communication disorders. I'm not just going to say language disorders, but communication disorders. So there's a difference. But we know that there is early history in working with children who are primarily deaf. Obviously, that's a communication impairment unless they're using sign language, and then we can say there's a language impairment as well. We do have the field of speech language pathologists developing, so we started to produce professionals to work with children with speech and language impairments. And so we start to see textbooks being written and the focus being on primarily speech. And so we have to remember that there's a difference between speech, language, and communication. So, what is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of Children with Speech and Language Impairment? And the definition we have is that these children have a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects a child's educational performance. So we need to define communication. So let's define some of these terms. So for communication to take place, there has to be at minimum two people because there has to be someone who sends a message and someone who receives a message. And so when we talk about disorders, the breakdown can be in sending and or it can be in receiving. So what is language then? Well, language has to have a symbol system. So when we use language, we're using symbols for communication. And it's based on a culture as well. So when you look at the particular slide here, you see that hello can be symboled, I'll say, in many different languages. Um, and children have to both express their language and we have to have a receiver for there to be communication. But we also have speech built in here as well, and we also have some components of language that we have to understand. And so the most basic forms of speech are our phonemes. And so we have approximately 47 phonemes in the English language. The smallest unit of speech that has meaning is considered morphology, right? So we have single speech sounds and we have smallest units of speech that have meaning, such as in is a morphology. Syntax is our rules, our grammar, how we form things to produce our language, and then we have our form of our language. Semantics gives us our meaning, all right, so our content has to have meaning. And pragmatics gives us the reason for communicating. So we have reasons. We ask questions, we make statements, and that also has a function to it. So when we study language disorders, the reason we have to understand these definitions is that there can be breakdown in any of these areas. And so children with specific language impairments can have such things as a delay, overall delay in their language. They can have an actual language disorder termed aphasia, or they could have central auditory processing problems where they're not processing the language as well, so they're not retrieving the language. They also could have challenges in their speech, and we know that many young children will mess up sounds, and that's just developmental until they actually can form these sounds within their mouth and in their other parts of their speech mechanisms. Also, there can be difficulties with pitch or intensity or quality of speech. The fluency and the articulation are all speech disorders that can occur in all areas actually of the mouth and the neck and our breathing mechanisms. So a this is a lower incidence here, but actually if we include all the children that have communication, language, and speech disorders, it's about 24%. But here for actual specifically speech disorders, they're saying approximately 1.7%. And there's actually, again, a gender difference. So we see more boys than females. And so we have a number of children that are in need of speech language pathology services. So, what are the causes? Again, we have pretty much similar causes. We have the biological, but there's also, you know, there could be physical problems with a child. There also could be emotional reasons as to why a child will not communicate effectively. Environmental causes do include neglect, abuse, poverty, malnutrition. So, what do these children look like cognitively? Well, again, no single child is the same. So, a full range of cognitive abilities, from gifted on to children who have more challenges in terms of their cognition. These problems can affect the children in terms of their learning, and specifically in the area of reading difficulties. Social emotional characteristics, it depends on the problem, but you can imagine that if you cannot communicate effectively or your speech is impaired, that some students may have low self-esteem as a result. They may experience social isolation, and or they may develop some kind of behavioral problem. Speech assessments are generally done by a speech language pathologist. However, um, the speech language pathologist may certainly ask you to take some note of what's happening in the classroom. What are your observations of the child in terms of the child's communication? But generally, a speech pathologist will check on articulation. They will take spontaneous language samples to see how the child's speaking. There will be a developmental history, but there also may be examinations, not just by the speech language pathologist, but by doctors who look at things such as the mouth, the teeth, the palate, the breathing mechanism of the child. Formal language assessments, well, we have both formal and informal. So a language sample might be considered more informal, but there are actually formal language assessments that the speech language pathologist will implement. They will look at samples of the child's work, because language does not just encompass speech, but it is written as well. So we write our language. They will observe the child in the classroom along with the teacher. And they will also, there's a precaution here, they will make sure that whatever assessment they give is unbiased. And so when we're talking about, for example, children who speak in a different native language. So we have these eligibility questions. Children cannot receive an IEP unless we can make sure that we've gone through the process correctly and that we can respond to these questions as needed. So does the student have significant delays or difference in speech language for his or her age? Does the student's speech language adversely affect the child's educational performance? And can the student benefit from special education from an IEP? In early childhood, little difficult to diagnose if there's simply, I don't want to say simply, but an articulation problem, because that's normal in young children. But here we're talking about those children where we can really identify a speech and language delay, such as perhaps children with autism. So early intervention services are going to be very important. At the elementary and secondary level, we're certainly going to look to see if there are delays. What does their language look like in comparison to their typical chronologically aged peers? So the teacher will be providing services to the child. The child may receive direct services through a speech language pathologist. Generally, children with speech language impairment are included in the general education classroom, and there's collaboration between the teacher and the therapists. So when we get to the point where we're talking about transition, then at ages 14 up through the time the child will graduate, we want to make sure the child can advocate for him or herself. So teaching those skills of self-advocacy, decision-making skills, skills for successful functioning in their future careers, self-esteem building, and awareness of their personal strengths, but also awareness of their limitations. Technology may play a large part for this population. So we're looking at augmentative to augment their communication, and sometimes even an alternative communication system. So an AAC system for the child may be necessary. An unaided system would be sign language. Unaided meaning this is a child who has good motor skills, good cognitive skills, can learn signs. The child may also need an aided system, meaning some form of actual technology that they carry with them, either by hand if they can carry it, or attached to a wheelchair, such as a communication board with speech processing and are using word prediction software. Um, we're going to be, if they're going to be using technology, their child's going to need practice and skill development with it. And so that's going to be important. And sometimes the teacher will have to use technology as well, such as wearing an FM device if the child needs sound amplification and the teacher needs to be able to hear the child as well, but also, I should say, the child hear the teacher. Um, Parent and family perspectives of this population, we have to make sure we're working with parents and that they understand what's happening in the school. What are we working on with the child in terms of enhancing their speech and language, and certainly ensuring collaboration. Interventions may be difficult to support at home for parents not fluent in English, but that shouldn't be a reason that we don't try. We should be working with translators and the multidisciplinary team to make sure that parents understand what we're doing, and if they can replicate anything in the home, that they're able to do so. We should note cultural differences may affect the value placed on certain interventions we choose and be sensitive to that. Trends with this population, identifying and addressing disabilities in a multicultural society is very important. There's going to be language differences versus language disorders. So language differences do not necessarily equate to a language disorder. We're going to have differences in accents and dialects. Basing student interventions on evidence-based practices, definite trends. So are we using research-based interventions in terms of our interventions for speech language services? We're going to need to be collecting data, using that data to make decisions about our interventions for the child, and we're going to have to continue our education. And that takes us through Chapter 9.